Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Pramod K. Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. In this module, we will be looking at a specific component of cultural studies that deals with the idea of textuality and of culture as text. The traditional notion of text has to do with the evolution of print. In cultural studies, a major shift has been made when it begins to evaluate culture itself as text, and we increasingly see references to cultural texts. This calls for a radical rethinking of what we understand by the word text. It's not just the printed word or an image, but something more than that. If we think of culture as a language or culture as a text, does it then in some odd fashion take away the experiences of people? Does it reduce everything to the question of language? Does it widen the gap between theory and practice? Are there alternative methods of reading the text of culture? These are some of the problems that have arisen and have been resolved in various ways, primarily due to the arrival of various forms of theorizing about the nature of texts and also the nature of culture. First, the idea of a text. A text has to be seen as a multidimensional space. It is not simply words on a page. The text doesn't end when the book ends. The text is not the set of signs which are printed on one square sheet of paper. A text refers to several other texts. Theorists have argued that the work is the physical book we hold in our hand, but a text is a process. A text exceeds or transcends the idea of a physical book. Now, this is a very important argument, and it conveys to us the various possibilities of looking at text. The essential thing to be kept in mind here is a text therefore does not become restricted to the words on the page. Roland Barthes, whose work was later on taken up in many serious thinkers in a school of thought we understand as Poststructuralism, proposed the distinction between work and text. To go back to the point I have made, a work is a physical book that you hold in the hand, but a text is a process in language. This means a text consists of signs. By signs we mean words with concepts attached. But, and this is the key part, a text constantly draws upon, reflects, alludes to, references other texts. This means every text has a connection with other texts. This is what we understand as a concept of intertextuality. Intertextuality simply suggests that a text is a network. It's a collection, or a set of references that run across texts. So every text is necessarily something that borrows from and adapts across text, and we therefore need to read a text not as an isolated unit, that this book you close and the text is over, but you have to see a text as something that is across, spread across, networking across various other texts. This essentially means that you cannot think of a text as final. You cannot see a text as self-contained. A text refers to other texts, draws upon other texts, and we as readers need to understand that one text can only be read in the light of other similar or dissimilar texts. Now, a text communicates, as I pointed out, through a system of signs. But what is a sign? And what constitutes the idea of a sign? The arguments about signs were first articulated in very precise fashion by a linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure proposed that a sign consists of two key components, a signifier and a signified. The signifier is the word C-A-T, meaning cat. That arrangement of letters, the three letters C-A-T, cat, is a signifier, is just a system whereby the letters of an English alphabet have been put together to make that word. But the important thing to be kept in mind is this word carries within it a whole history of what we understand as an animal. The concept behind the word is the signified. The word is a signifier. A sign therefore consists of the signifier and the signified put together. This is not as easy as we think, that a word consists of a set of letters, a system of marks, and then a concept. What Saussure did was to propose something radical. He suggested that the relationship between the letters, the word, and the concept is completely arbitrary. In other words, if I say the word cat, you understand it to mean a four-legged, furry animal that has certain behavioral characteristics. But is there anything in the letters that tell you that this is what the animal is, or is it that we have come to associate the animal with the word? See, the animal doesn't announce its name. It doesn't say it is a cat. We have said, when I write the letters here and I put the animal here, this means this. But there is actually no connection between the letters on this side and the animal on this side. It is only because of social conventions, a system of shared interpretation, that we have associated the word with the idea, the word with the concept, and the word with the animal. What Saussure was essentially telling us is, meaning is random, is arbitrary. It's only because as a society we might decide that this means this. The word itself carries no significance. We decide it carries this particular value. For example, if you just need to understand this a little better, think of what we understand as quote-unquote bad language. We tell children, do not use bad language. What does that mean? It only means that certain words carry a certain kind of meaning in particular context, and we do not want you to use them. But the words are words. It's only that over a period of time, we have associated certain words with abuse, racism, sexism, or whatever you want. Think of it. But the word by itself is innocent. It is only that we as a society have decided that this is not an acceptable meaning. And cat, cat meaning an animal, is an acceptable meaning. So Saussure was essentially telling us that language is unstable. Language is not to be relied on. It's only because society has a set of conventions that brings the signifier and the signified together. So let's get this very clear, that the word and the concept have absolutely no connection with each other. That connection is what we as a social order, as a social system, force upon it. Alright, that's the first point to be made. Now, Saussure also argued that a word makes sense only in comparison with something else, and a word can be exchanged with some other word. This essentially means that meaning is relational. Let me explain what this as a consequence produces. I say to you, this is a cat, and you would ask me, but what does cat mean? How does it sound? What does it look like? Now, if I write cat cat on the board, the only way you can understand cat cat is because it is different from the word bat, hat hat, or any other word. That is, the word cat as written on the board makes sense because we can see that it is different from another word. Because we can perceive that CAT arranged in that order is not BAT. It's not HAT. This is what is the principle of rationality, relationality. That a word makes sense because it is different from another word. Language is based on a system of relations of difference and exchange. Suppose I were to say, I live in a house. You are not going to find that odd. Now the word house can actually be substituted without changing the sentence structure with several other words. I live in a cave. I live on a ship. I live in a boat. The sentence I live in or I live on remains unchanged. What we are looking at here is a key structure of the way language operates. We have a syntagmatic which is to do with the syntax, the arrangement of words in a line, and we have a paradigmatic structure. Let me explain this more fully. The word house can be substituted with the word cave, boat, moon, and the sentence remains unchanged, but the meaning becomes different. That is, we have a paradigm from which we can take the word house, cat, bat. We can take the words house, boat, palace, market. Those are our options without changing the essential structure. I live in A. I own a pet which is a cat. It can be substituted with a bat, a python, or a giraffe. The essential structure, the syntagmatic structure does not change. The paradigm, the options of choosing words would be ours. This means our choice of words is determined by how we want to convey some things, but also in terms of the acceptance of this in a social system. How we have learned to associate a particular order and a particular paradigm so that it makes a particular kind of sense. Meaning is relational, meaning is based on difference. If I were to say, I live on a boat, your immediate question would be, why do you live on a boat rather than live in a house? You see, your interpretation of that is based on my choice of the paradigmatic structure rather than the syntagmatic one. I live in a makes perfect sense, but I live on a boat and I live in a cave. They are very different from I live in a house. So the important thing to understand is meaning is not inherent, is not intrinsic to any words. The meaning we generate out of a sentence, out of a word, out of a system of signs is arbitrary, relational, and based on difference. Saussure's contribution was to therefore essentially point to the instability of all language systems. That is the general idea of a sign. But what is the role of this in cultural studies? Our reality is constantly being shaped by the language we use, the language that is acceptable to people, the language that the social order has determined. Like all language, our life, our meaning making is structured by certain underlying principles. The significance for cultural studies is the emphasis on language forces us to pay more attention to questions of representations, to the way meaning is put into the form of a word, a sentence, an image, or a film. One specific demonstration of the role of language was demonstrated by a French thinker called Roland Barthes, who proposed that the sign, when taken to the second order of usage, becomes myth. A myth is formed when the sign becomes a signifier for something larger. A symbol may be, a metaphor. For example, a map can be a sign, but when the map becomes the idea of a country, when the map becomes translated into the metaphor of a nation, of the idea of nationalism, we have generated a second order of signs. Barthes' contribution here is to take Saussure in linguistics, the foundation of language, and convert it into a larger cultural practice. What he was referring to, therefore, is to propose that there is the process of signification, which is the process of making meaning, but there is also a process whereby language exists because meaning is generated out of already existing meaning. You see, the map makes one kind of meaning, but the minute the map is used to talk about the idea of a country, the cultural unity of a country, we have developed something larger than that. Later, French theorists and the contemporary schools from the 70s and 80s of deconstruction would argue that all language is essentially metaphorical. I'm not going that far at this point in time. What I'm drawing your attention to is that any system of signs can be then appropriated to generate another system. This second system is what Barthes is calling a meta-language, and what I have proposed can serve as a metaphor, as a figure of speech, or as a larger concept. So what you look at is the transformation of the first order of science with its associated meanings into a second order of science with that set of associated meanings. Poststructuralism built on both Saussure and Roland Barthes, and one might see poststructuralism as an extension, therefore, of what has been done before. Poststructuralism's major point of intervention was Saussure's old argument. All language is relational, which implies that all language is inherently unstable. One word leads to another word, that word leads to yet another word. Please recall here what I have said about the text as a set of networks, as a series of connections, allusions and references to other texts. What poststructuralism did was therefore to make a very important point. If you want to understand a text, you need to know about other texts. Then how can you say that the meaning exists only in one text? In other words, if I were to say any sentence such as, I own a cat. That's my sentence, I own a cat. Now the person who is listening to me says, but I don't understand your use of the word cat. What does cat mean? There I'll have to explain. A cat means a furry, four-legged animal. And the person, my listener, says, I don't quite understand the word furry. Then I have to explain. Human beings have hair, animals have fur. And this person asks me, but I don't understand, what is an animal? As you can see, meaning does not exist in a sentence which says, I own a cat. Meaning exists because that sentence keeps referring to the words in that sentence, the signs in that sentence demand other words. Every word refers to every other word. Every sentence needs other sentences. Every text refers to other texts. This simply means there is no meaning inherent in a text. But it also means something else. It means meaning cannot be finalized. Because a text is open, endless, a set of networks, meaning does not rest in any single text. What poststructuralism did was to propose, therefore, an unfinalizability of meaning, that the system of signification is more or less endless. At this point you can ask me, but then how do we make sense of anything? How do we make meaning? The answer to that is fairly simple. We come to a meaning when we decide that this is the meaning. We say, we have been speaking one sentence, two sentences, third sentence, fourth sentence. By the fifth sentence, we have come to a meaning. It does not mean that the meaning has stopped there. It only means that the process of signification has generated adequate meaning for our specific purpose in this particular moment. It's important here to understand what this implies. It implies that meaning is never in a text. Meaning is in the act of interpretation. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida extended this further. He said, all acts of interpretation believe that there is a center or an essence to a text. He called it logocentrism. That all Western philosophy believes that there is a particular core meaning in a text. That meaning is available. There is meaning in any cultural system. And there is a final point where we think all meaning proceeds from or all meaning resides. This center, as Derrida points out, is itself made of other texts. When we approach and come to the center and assume that the center contains all that meaning, you discover that at the center there are more texts. Derrida proposed that the idea of a center, the idea of an essential meaning, is a myth. You cannot believe in the logos, the center of a text, because the center is itself made of several things. The idea of logocentrism denies the centrality, the center of a text, and it's often referred to therefore as decentering. It argues that language only can refer to other words, other texts, and does not carry any inherent meaning. This shift, this process of reading text from structuralism through deconstruction and poststructuralism is often described as a linguistic turn. The linguistic turn effectively proposed that the process of interpreting cultures is actually the process of interpreting the process of how meaning gets made, that we pay attention to language. If we see culture as a system of science, then the system of science needs to be interpreted. We need to understand how words have been put together. Now, I would like you to recognize one thing. When we say science, we don't necessarily mean just words, because obviously a culture does not mean just words. It could be paintings, it could be music, it could be other sounds, it could be colors, numbers, what have you. We think of science as a system of marks. These are not just printed words. This is an extremely important point to be kept in mind, because very often we tend to think that poststructuralism advocates a return to the printed word. That's not quite true. The linguistic turn referred to the instability of meaning, but it was not arguing that the text is everything. What in fact it was trying to say that the world takes on a textual form, but that text itself is unstable. So do not please think that deconstruction or poststructuralism returns us to the sanctity of a text. Far from it, in fact. However, this proposal to read the linguistic turn in cultural studies poses several other problems. First, the cultural studies approach within the linguistic turn focuses on text but often ignores everyday speech. That is, it does not look at the moments in which, the context in which we routinely speak. We should not think of, and this is what the detractors of the linguistic turn say, we should not think in terms of just certain kinds of cultural texts. Everyday speech is also textual. Everyday speech is also generative of meaning. So the linguistic turns what they think of as an over-reliance on the textual often ignores the everydayness of cultural practices. The second point that the detractors make is we cannot see any culture as having a dominant linguistic, cultural or signifying system, because there are always counter-linguistic, counter-signifying systems as well. That is, language can be used for dominance, hegemony and oppression, but language in the hands of people can also be turned against it. It can be a counter-hegemonic strategy. What does this mean? It means that the same system of signification, the same system of science can be appropriated by common people to generate radically new meanings. One doesn't necessarily have to go with the hegemonic, standardized system of interpretation. One does not necessarily have to say this can only mean this. It can also be made to mean something else. If you have paid attention to what I said before, this has everything to do not with the language but the context in which that language is used. Cultural studies' emphasis on the everyday life means that the language of everyday life is important and not the language of elitism. It's not the language of a specialized class. Language in the hands of the common person, the illiterate, the lower classes, the unemployed, can be used as a radical destabilizing form of meaning making. The important thing to understand here is the linguistic turn very often excludes the question of ethics, of change, and the morality of interpretation. What does this mean? For a lot of people, the way language is used and the way language gets analyzed in this kind of approach excludes normally the procedural, the formal modes through which ethics need to be reinforced. For instance, what is the role of a racist language? The minute we use the phrase racist language, we are not speaking in terms of linguistic structures alone. We are not talking in terms of sign or signification alone. We are speaking about the moment of enunciation, the everyday use of a language which can be discriminatory or oppressive. We are essentially talking, therefore, ethics. People who have a problem with the linguistic turn often, therefore, offer alternative ways of reading culture. One would include ethnographic studies. Ethnographic studies are studies that account for detailed accounts of everyday life, habits, speech patterns, food and clothing of people from various cultural backgrounds. Alternative readings also emphasize that individual users possess some amount of agency and independence. Agency is the ability to determine the course of your action but also of others' action. If I wish to do something and I am able to do it, then I am deemed to possess agency. Now, when people speak in terms of the linguistic turn, it's assumed that the linguistic turn does not account for this question of agency. And for people who oppose the linguistic turn, the question of ethics and the question of agency are inseparable in cultural studies because, and this is very important, the common person and the everyday life possess forms of agency within themselves. The way identity is forged, for example, is through a process of signification. A particular community has a system of signs whereby certain people are assigned an identity. But for cultural studies, because the emphasis is on the linguistic turn, the system of signification determines the identity of a person and it fixes it that way. For people who dispute the linguistic turn, this becomes a denial of the agency of the subjects. In the alternate ways of reading culture, most of these people emphasize the fact that language turned inside out, used in different ways, offers some amount of agency to the user, but it also means that the identity of the user is not restricted to the language already available. That is, pre-given language is not the only way an identity is available. Identity is becoming because language used in different ways generates different kinds of what is called in philosophy subjectivity. In contemporary times, this has shifted to something called critical discourse analysis. The important thing about critical discourse analysis, often abbreviated as CDA, is to look at real life data unedited, put together to examine what it means. The focus here is yet again on everyday life. How many people watch television and what kinds of shows they watch, how many people go to the malls, what are the stores they go to, what kind of purchases they make. What is important about critical discourse analysis is to look at markers in language, in systems of textual signification through which identities become established, how people sort out everyday lives. Now, what is interesting about the discourse component of cultural studies, which relies oddly enough on the linguistic turn, is that the focus remains on the everyday. It affords a sense of agency to the individuals, but it also points to the contradictions within the cultural system. What we have seen in the linguistic turn is an emphasis on signification. But what I'm urging you to see is that the traditional way of looking at culture as a system of texts or signs is not really adequate. We need more than just an understanding of the system of signs. We need ethnographic studies to look at habits and behavior. For example, clothing and food and games and leisure activities are also components that add meaning. The interesting and important part of cultural studies when it looks at such representational moves is that The question of meaning making is not just a question of the texts or signs used. It is an emphasis on the context in which those signs are used. Words, images, filmic, sounds, gestural are all enunciated, and the emphasis is on the word enunciated. Enunciated in particular contexts at particular moments. This critical discourse analysis approach forces us to pay attention to strategies of representation, but it also forces us to see the processes of cultural production and cultural consumption. How is a text like a film or a rock music show or a cartoon produced, what we understand as cultural production? What are the factors that contribute to it? It's not enough to say, oh, the film text contains this, this and this. For critical discourse analysis and cultural studies, it's important to ask how those texts have been put together and how they get consumed. So we are looking not only in terms of language as words, but language as articulated, or the word I used before, enunciated in particular contexts. Increasingly, cultural studies has shifted towards studies of cultural production. The work of Kajri Jain in India on calendar art is a good instance of this. Angela McRobbie's work on rock music in the United States is another example. What these thinkers try to do is to look at the factors of production in which a cultural artifact gets produced. But the other end of it also occurs in, say, reception or audience studies. How do people respond to this? Please recall that I said meaning is not just the function of a text. Meaning is how we read that text and a system of social conventions that determine what a text contains. It's important to recognize this. So any cultural practice has two ends, cultural production and cultural consumption. For a very long time, cultural studies focused on the first part of it, the languages of cultural production. But with the arrival of reception and audience studies, we look at how people receive meaning, how people make sense of meaning. In this particular module, therefore, we have not only explored the linguistic turn, we have also paid attention to the drawbacks of the linguistic turn. We have noted alternative ways of reading cultural texts. In my concluding remarks, I noted that we in cultural studies increasingly pay attention to the two poles of any cultural artifact, cultural production and cultural consumption. Starting with the reading of structuralism and structuralist theories, we moved on to the analysis of deconstruction and poststructuralism and what it meant. We looked at the theory of unstable language, the intertextuality of texts, the free-floating nature of all texts and textuality, and the social factors, the social conventions that produce meaning. We pointed out that critical discourse analysis takes this a step further by looking at ethnography, the conditions of production, the conditions of reception, and other forms of recording everyday life. We noted that the cultural studies linguistic turn remains focused on everyday, on the ordinary, on the common, but, and this is the crucial part, it also demands we pay attention to the possibilities of agency in the everyday reception of things. Thank you.